So, you've experienced existential dread, or perhaps you'd like to know more about this charming place we call reality. Either way, philosophy has been recommended by top philosophers for millennia as a way to approach these knowledge rabbit holes. I mean, what does good even mean in the first place? Does free will exist? Is a burrito a sandwich? If you're someone who wants to start their journey into philosophy, I think the best thing to do is ask yourself two things. Firstly, what draws you to philosophy? And secondly, how do you best enjoy learning things? By answering these questions, we can determine what philosophers and philosophies to look at, as well as how to go about studying them. After all, it makes sense to start learning about what you want to learn about in a way that suits you. For me, I remember getting really into ethics as a teenager when I noticed there were lots of things that I thought were up with society. You know, how there are legal loopholes that big businesses use to avoid paying those pesky taxes, but carrying around a small amount of a substance that might have potential psychological benefits is a big no-no. So teenage me was like, it looks like not all things that are legal are morally permissible, and not all things that are illegal are bad. I mean, define bad and all that. For you, it might be something completely different. From wanting to know the answer to a deep question, to thinking about the best way to live life. I know at the moment stoicism is pretty poppin' on the YouTube algorithm. Once you have these initial topics and you do a bit of research on them, I've often found they lead to other questions, some of which will really draw you in. This has been my preferred method of bouncing between topics. For example, thinking about whether or not a burrito is a sandwich has led me to some great tequila cocktail recipes. Let's get a bit more practical about options you have when learning philosophy. Books. Yeah, a bit of an obvious one, but one that's important to mention. A few books I'd recommend to beginners would include The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell, which is an overview of, you guessed it, Western philosophy, written by Bertrand Russell. This is a really great introduction to lots of different philosophers and philosophies. And before you know it, you'll have a crippling philosophy addiction, like me. For Eastern philosophy, The Way of Zen by Alan Watts is a great introduction to Western audiences. You know, Alan Watts, that guy from those fire Lofi compilations. Fiction is another great way to start thinking about philosophy. For instance, my A-level ethics teacher recommended that everyone read Sophie's Choice. Well, everyone in the class. And yeah, it's pretty good. Of course, if you have a specific interest in a specific philosophy or philosopher, just go ahead and read their books. So that's obvious, and you knew that. Many books also come in audio form. My audio isn't so good today because it's very windy. I personally really enjoy audiobooks. A long walk in the countryside with a philosophy audiobook, mwah. Lovely. For some reason, there are people out there that choose to formally study philosophy at university. People like me. I really enjoyed being taught and critiqued by experts in the field. Plus, the debates and discussion with fellow students was incredibly valuable to me. Also, the job prospects after studying philosophy aren't as bad as some people think. Although I'm really happy I studied philosophy at university, I completely appreciate that formal education isn't for everyone. Even if it is, I completely understand why some people wouldn't want to dedicate that much time and money towards it. It's totally possible to learn philosophy outside of an academic setting. With the internet, there's plenty of ways to find other people to discuss philosophy with. Podcasts. Learn philosophy while you're washing up, commuting to work, or trying to fill the void of silence with human voice. I'm sure you know how podcasts work, and there are philosophy podcasts. This can be a great way to hear people discuss and debate philosophical topics. The Partially Examined Life is one of my personal favourites. YouTube, the place I'm speaking to you on right now. Did you know that YouTube is the world's second largest search engine? Just type in the philosopher or idea you want to learn about and hit enter. In time, the algorithm will do the rest and take you down the rabbit hole. Try not to get radicalised now. There are so many terrific creators on the platform. Philosophy Tube in particular is one I'd really recommend. The internet more broadly can also be really helpful. Wikipedia even has a whole page detailing different topics within philosophy. But all the cool kids know that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is where it's really at. Each entry is written and maintained by an expert in the field. It tends to be my favourite place to go a little bit deeper before buying a book. Philosophy is pretty broad. There are way too many topics to go over here. Start Start with what you're drawn to and go from there. Or visit that really long Wikipedia article. Some of my favourite broad fields of philosophy include aesthetics, which deals with questions like, is a burrito art? I also really enjoy the philosophy of language. What do we really mean when we say burrito? Now here are some things that I wish I'd known when starting on my philosophy journey. One piece of advice I'd give to people starting to learn philosophy would be to always look at the other side of an argument. For instance, there are some quite fun thought experiments used to challenge certain ideas. Take utilitarianism, the belief that what is moral is the greatest good for the greatest number. Greatest good being measured by the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure. Broadly speaking, of course. Noticing this, Robert Nozick came up with a pretty fun thought experiment. If utilitarianism were true, then appeasing the utility monster would be the most moral thing to do. But Ed, what is the utility monster? Well, the utility monster is a monster that can feel pleasure way more than you or I or anyone else in the world. Chocolate chip cookies are delicious. I would derive, say, 5 units of pleasure from eating a chocolate chip cookie. However, what if the utility monster gains 1,000,000 units of pleasure from eating said cookie? This would mean that the morally just thing to do would be feed the utility monster all the cookies. And here's where things get even darker than cookies. What if the only thing the utility monster likes more than cookies is human flesh? Being eaten alive by the utility monster does sound pretty painful, both for you and those who love you. Say that totals 10 million units of pain. But what if the utility monster gains incomprehensible pleasure from eating your flesh? Does this mean that everyone is morally obligated to feed themselves to the utility monster? After all, the pleasure the monster gets from eating our flesh far surpasses any pain felt by us, especially from our puny human brains. I don't know, man, philosophy's pretty fun. Don't worry about becoming an expert in every single field of philosophy. There's so much philosophy out there, it would be impossible to become an expert in everything. Even legendary philosophers have their areas of expertise, so don't let people be gatekeepy and weird about you not having read a certain philosopher, especially at the beginning. Even if you're studying philosophy at university, you'll generally be able to pick topics that you're going to specialise in. Some philosophers are harder to read than others, and that's okay. For example, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is quite a bit easier to read than Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. If you come across a philosophy book that's a bit too difficult, don't worry too much about it and try something else. Although I do think it's good to push yourself sometimes. I do like that not too difficult but still challenging sweet spot. You'll find that for yourself the more you read. The same applies if something's too boring. Pick another topic and return when the interest strikes you. Unless of course you're studying philosophy at university. Ah, those were the days. Really get into the habit of asking why as you're reading things. For instance, the sentence, "they took our jobs." What do they mean by they? What do they mean by took? What do they mean by our, and what do they mean by jobs? If you are reading a philosophical text, it can be valuable to consider when and where the philosopher was writing, as it may greatly influence their arguments. For example, Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most famous philosophical pessimists, wrote all of his work before the release of Rush Hour 2. I mean, you know, there is a correlation there. After learning something new in philosophy, I often find going for a walk is a great way to reflect upon what I've just learned. If you choose to learn more about philosophy, I'm sure you'll find it really valuable too. To summarise, I think it's really important to follow your own individual interests when it comes to philosophy. Do this and you're bound to find plenty of new ideas along the way. Today, there are so many ways to learn philosophy, so find one you enjoy and that suits you. Remember, be critical in what you read, always ask questions, and think about why those with an opposing viewpoint might think what they think. You'll be better at debates with them if you do that.